now come to the practical application of our very flimsy knowledge of magnetism and how we have struggled to bring some sort of order out of our chaotic knowledge. One of the first efforts to use magnetism, unfortunately, was in the field of radionics, And it all began way back in San Francisco when a Dr. Abrams began to discover strange effects in the human body, and he began to put together what was known as an Abrams box. I'm not going to dwell on that for the moment. But deriving directly from Abrams, George Delaware began his experimentations. And ultimately, in the end, after, I should say, about $300,000 later, he was able to show to the, shall we say, to the satisfaction of people like myself, who am not biased. He was able to show to our satisfaction anyway, that if you placed a bar magnet near to a blood spot, if you placed a bar magnet like this little one here near a blood spot and used a stick pad to detect any sort of response from the blood or radiation from the blood, then it was possible to produce certain phenomena. In other words, if this bar magnet was sunk into a well, and I'm going to show you it on a machine in a moment, and it lay next to the blood spot, and I could rotate the bar magnet, I could find by means of a stick pad, which really would indicate a change of electrical potential in the skin, I would be able to find with a stick pad, can't get my stick pad working today, I would be able to find with a stick pad can you hear that stick? Not getting it really, it hasn't been used for a long, long time. I would be able to find with a stick pad when there was a critical position between this magnet and that blood spot. When this occurred, it would mean that the blood spot was in a position to be treated. Yes, that's better. If I'm stroking this and I'm turning, this would be on the machine, as I'll show you in a moment, and I'm turning the blood spot in relation to the, turning the magnet, the bar magnet on the end of a control, a knob, I'm turning that in relation to the blood spot, I would get a position in which there was a critical affinity between the magnetic field and the blood spot. There'd be a change in the electrical potential of my skin, and I would get a stick sound on a pad which is incorporated onto the whole machine. Now, this would indicate affinity between the magnetic field of the bar magnet and the blood spot. And by this means, he was able then to build an instrument in which a series of resistors, tell me if I'm saying anything wrong, Claire, in which a series of resistors which had knobs on top of them were then placed around or in relation to this magnetic field, like that. And in fact, this is what we are seeing in this particular instrument. We are seeing here, thank you very much, we are seeing here a magnet underneath this knob which rotates. The blood spot was put into this well or that well, depending on certain conditions. This was rotated, and at the same time you waited until you got a stick. Then that magnetic field was, as it were, en rapport with a blood spot placed in there. Then you could start working these dials, setting these dials up to produce through their resistors, just a coiled wire, thank you, Claire, just a coiled wire, a system of diagnosing imbalance of a person 6,000 miles away through his blood spot. Now, when the High Court case against Delaware, somebody sued Delaware for fraud, was brought about. One of the contentions of the prosecution was that his black box, and that was one of them, his black box was nothing more than a box full of nothing, and it was a fraud. Nothing represented these coils of wires, which we will be able to see later. And today, of course, we know, if you have listened to Bill Cox on the subject of energy fields around spatial objects like pyramids, we find that the most efficient of all shapes is this one. The most efficient of all shapes is a spiral coil like that. Lukasovsky, is that his name? Lukovsky. Lukovsky, of course, used to take just a coil of copper wire like that, which didn't touch. The ends didn't touch, and this would interest Jerry, who is sitting in the room here tonight and is your expert from Findhorn. And if you stuck that on a piece of stick into the ground, you could put it around a plant, and the plant would grow tremendously. It would have added growth and energy fields and so on just by this coil. Well, we now find that this sort of shape is the most efficient of all. And the Delaware box then was bringing energy fields which could be adjusted to the sensitivity of what we believe was the sensitivity of the operator or the healer, as that sensitivity relates to his own soul. And that in itself was so way out, that it only pushed the reputation of magnetism further into the mire. And important though it is, as Delaware himself said, it would have been far better if the work we did on these magnetic instruments had come long before he had attempted radionics, because he went even further still. Instead of just diagnosing on this basis with a radionic instrument, and I might just mention that there is a very, very fine, the world's finest radionic clinic at the Delaware Laboratories in Oxford still to this day, and when you are faced with somebody in absolute desperation for treatment of a condition that does not respond, then you can always say, why don't you send a blood spot to the Delaware Laboratories in Oxford and let them try it out? And indeed, if you did, you would get a response, and they would tell you what would have to be done. At least you would know that you are trying to do something helpful for whoever it is that is seeking aid. And they would take the blood spot. The mechanism is that you place a spot of blood on a piece of blotting paper because it would give the blood 3 dimensions, and then you don't put any writing on that piece of blotting paper. It must be absolutely clean. Nobody must touch it. Then you enclose it in an envelope and then write a list of your symptoms. Send them, only the symptoms, case history if you wish, to the Delaware Laboratories. They diagnose from this information in the blood spot your condition radionically. It need not necessarily coincide with the medical diagnosis, but it may. And then they will treat you. Usually treatment is about 6 weeks, and you are expected to write back and say what changes you are noting, a change of symptoms. And as your symptoms change, you must notify them, because they will adjust the machine accordingly. Now, I'm not here today to talk about any minor branches of the science. I'm just here to give a review. Then, of course, Delaware went even further to the horror of the scientific world in Britain. He began to produce photography related to magnetism. And by this we mean that the blood spot next to the bar magnet was photographed. The blood spot was photographed. He incorporated, as you can see, a lovely radionic instrument of Claire's there. That's Bruce Copeland, all right. He incorporated, Delaware would turn in his grave if he knew that was Bruce Copeland's machine. he incorporated 3 of these machines into a sort of camera, and the camera had a lens that focused on the region of the blood spot. The dials were set to the condition. If it was a 3 months pregnancy, then 3 months pregnancy was set up on the dials, and the person's blood was put there. The person might be 1,000 miles away, and a photograph was taken. And in many instances, these photographs would reveal the outline of the pregnancy or whatever disease condition was set up on the instrument. And so you could photograph from a blood spot the embryo, the 3 months fetus of a woman pregnant 1,000 miles away, merely by photographing the blood. Now, it's incredible, it's amazing, and not at this festival, but certainly at the festivals ahead. We will go back again and we'll look into Delaware's work. I'll show you the slides and so on of this phenomenon. But you begin to understand now why magnetism went into further disrepute merely because of radionics. Not that the radionics was invalid, it was that it couldn't be, as it were, given a rationale at that time. It was shown again and again later that man has not only a magnetic field, and this is important to both Dr. Smith and Claire Warner here today. It was shown not only that man had a magnetic field which had seemed to go out from him in all directions, much like a magnet, but it was found that there were nodal points. By this we mean that the fields became intensified at regular intervals, nodal points. Node being like the notch on a bamboo stick. And these nodal points could be located quite easily. And they are in some way related to the disease condition. And if that person the next day was manifesting some disease condition, these nodal points tended to be staggered in certain ways. And so you got radionic, as it were, rates for the various disease conditions. At least that's how we think it works and so on. Worked almost exclusively on human beings. We have done some work on animals, and it would appear that work on animals seems to confirm what we have done on humans. I would also like to refer you to the Professors Barnathy of the physics department of, I believe, Illinois University. Anyway, they are in Chicago. And they have worked for 40 years academically on animals, showing a variety of effects of magnetic fields upon them. Their work has been exhaustively written up in a 2-volume edition, the name of which work eludes me for the moment, but it is written by Barnathy, Professors Barnathy. Madeline, I can remember, is the name of the wife. They're a husband-wife team. And their work is extensive, and I shall refer to it very briefly here today. We are going to trace now something of the history of magnetism, and I'm going to lead up to the work, the serious work that I did with George Delaware in the Delaware Laboratories at Oxford in London. The work with George Delaware began in 1967 and continued until his death 3 years later. It was a fact of history that magnetism has been the neglected energy of this planet. But it was not so way back in ancient days. In ancient days, when medicine was the field of, shall we say, the priest as well as the emerging doctor, magnetism was used extensively, but one can hardly compare those days with our own. It was used at a time in which A difficult diagnosis meant wheeling the patient into the temple and leaving him near the altar to sleep that night, huddled against the steps leading up to the gods themselves. And he would be assisted perhaps in his sleep to get the proper kind of sleep, and during the night, inevitably and almost invariably, the patient would have a vivid dream, and the dream would tell him what was wrong with himself. When he awakened in the morning, the physician would inquire as to the nature of the dream, and the dream would reveal the nature of his condition. In other words, higher beings were supplying the diagnosis. Well, it is against that sort of background that magnetism, as it were, was used. The name magnetism, of course, is credited to the name of a shepherd called Magnes, who was said to be walking over rocky prominences, tending his sheep, when the strong magnetic fields of the ferritite on which he was walking pulled the nails out of his sandals. And in those days, magnetism was regarded with amazement, the way in which a person could pick up a stone and immediately attract a whole string of other stones, forming a sort of chain. No wonder it was regarded with awe and considered to be an energy given by the gods. This is a pity, because from the very start, magnetism has been surrounded with a mystique of, shall we say, hocus pocus and magic and pseudo-magic, something that we have never been able to shake off in our previous lives. When I used magnetism not so very long ago, about 300, 400 years ago, and even to this day I have suffered from the stigma of magic and hocus pocus concerned with magnetism. Unfortunately, in our own present day, when we are struggling to make the science recognized and give it respectability, the very people who wish us well add to our problems by terming anything that they use in the way of energy as being magnetism. If you get any sort of healer and ask them what sort of energy they are using, the chances are 9 to 1 that they will say, oh, I'm using magnetism. And when you say, well, where's your magnet? They say, oh, well, I don't mean that sort of magnetism. I mean the magnetism that flows out of my fingertips and so on. And so it's been very, very difficult to give this field one of reputability. And indeed, we're struggling still at this time, having to use masks and cloaks in order to persist with the unfoldment and research development of such complex and abstruse instruments as you see here today. We're surprised to have anything of an audience, and indeed, if you don't mind my confessing it, and I'll be accused of my usual chauvinism and bombast, the presence of an audience here today is quite unnecessary for the functions that we're going to go through. We are here just to bring some prominent scientists together in this field, namely Dr. Al Smith from San Antonio, who is a research worker in this and other allied fields. He is a doctor of science in thermodynamics. There's Claire Warner, who worked for the Canadian government during the war as chief radar expert, and he brings his expertise into this field as well. Of course, we have inherited much from George Delaware, whose name we must revere in this field. We're talking about magnetism, and as we are esoteric, we may as well face it that the aura is magnetic. The aura is magnetic. It is for this reason that magnetism was called the beloved of the gods. Magnetic energy was called the beloved of the gods. And indeed, we now begin to find from all angles and approaches of research that this is true. Man possesses a magnetic field. We can measure that magnetic field with what is now being formulated as a it's the counterpart of encephalogram, which is the device that measures the brain waves. Then there is the electrocardiogram, which measures the electrical activities of the heart. And then there is a magnetogram or something like that, which is measuring the magnetic fields. No, that's a muscle thing. It is measuring the magnetic fields of the human body. Every time the heart pumps, it creates electrical fields, and these electrical fields spiral and whirl about in the circulation of the body, creating a magnetic pattern. Well, this, of course, is ancient teaching confirmed. Magnetism is the beloved of the gods because it is the energy of the human aura. And all the phenomena of Kirlian photography and all the phenomena associated with clairvoyance and the psychic sciences will ultimately be associated with electromagnetism. And I shall lead evidence in a moment to show that this is true. We're not putting this across today in a sort of an immaculate program to impress you. As I say, if you had not been here, we would have done the same sort of thing again in any case. But we like you to be here because that does help us to do this in a systematic sort of way. You must remember that we have grown up in the magnetic field. Man has evolved in a magnetic field. The Earth is a magnetic field. Geomagnetism and its effects are well known to us. There is the Earth in the Earth's magnetic field of North Pole and South Pole. We find that man is a magnetic entity as well. Man is a magnetic entity. I can remember touring this country not so long ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and pointing out that man's aura is magnetic, and that the north pole of man's magnetic aura lies in the third ventricle of the brain. In the third ventricle of the brain. Here you would have the ventricle, there you would have the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, and the occult teaching is that that is the North Pole. There's the cerebral hemispheres, there is the cerebellum, the medulla, and so on. Well, that is the North Pole of the magnetic field of the Earth. Of man. It is the counterpart of the Earth's North Pole. I say counterpart because I'm now speaking esoterically, because we are a planet in miniature. We are a solar system in miniature. This is an ancient teaching, and even if you studied the ultimate atom, you would find that the ultimate atom is a blur of energy, a wall of energy, as it were, in which there is an inflow of magnetism in the North Pole and an outflow in the South Pole. So it doesn't matter what we're talking about, from the tiniest atom to the greatest galaxy, all have magnetic patterns, all follow the proposition that each entity is made in the image of God, made in the image of the macrocosm. I am a microcosm of the macrocosm, which is the planet, and so on right up to the galaxy. So we have evolved on this planet, in the planet's magnetic field, a weak pulsating field that fluctuates with the sun's magnetic effects, bring one magnet near another magnet, and their fields are affected by each other. Similarly, the Earth's field is affected by the pulsating fields of the sun, especially during solar flares. We believe that this is the rationale of astrology, that very, very weak pulsating fields which may exist etherically and even astrally and even mentally reach and affect the magnetic fields of the Earth at an etheric, at an astral and a mental level. For you should never forget that the Earth is indeed interpenetrated by the astral planet Earth. We are completely interpenetrated with the astral planet, and indeed even with a mental planet. And therefore, these planets are susceptible to magnetic fields because the inner aura of the astral aura is just a counterpart of the physical and is magnetic in the same way. Betty, would you ring on the house phone and ask for the book table? Somebody must bring down a drawing from my room, which Sol Lewis did for me, of man's magnetic field. I'd like to have that. It's a green drawing. Magnetism. We have evolved in this field, and we are finding that man is sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. We are finding that just as women, and men even, are sensitive still to the lunar rhythm, the rhythm of the moon, conveying on women a 28-day period in which a new organ is built and destroyed in that 28 days during the menstrual cycle. Similarly so, in man, we have a pattern imposed upon him by the Earth's magnetic field. Some believe, for instance, that the average brain wave of about 10 cycles per second has been imposed upon man by the similar pulsations of the Earth magnetic field, which almost coincide exactly with 10 cycles a second. And this 10 cycles a second is being discovered as being particularly crucial in altered states of awareness. The cycle of 10 per second is crucial in altered states of awareness. In fact, looking at a flickering light becomes more effective when the light begins to flicker at the rate of about 10 times a second. Then we tend to have altered states of awareness. I was stressing all these facts because they are relevant in the research work. It was for this reason that George Delaware and myself chose not bar magnets with fixed fields, but chose pulsating magnetic fields to apply to the human body. Pulsating magnetic fields. And the instruments that you see here today are, generally speaking, magnetic fields that are weak, like the Earth's magnetic field, and they are pulsating, like the Earth's magnetic field. And it is with these sort of fields that we have done our experimentation. The examples that I want to quote to you, and you'll have to just bear with me, they're not particularly tedious. The examples that I want to quote are relevant here of effects of magnetism on the life of the Earth. The effects of magnetism on the light. Here, where are we? Right. We are beginning to find that the human body clocks, the clocks of the human body, which trigger off reactions in the body, reactions to our environment, these clocks are affected by light and darkness. And so we talk about circadian rhythm, the effect of light and darkness, circadian rhythm on man's body clocks. And these clocks are terribly important. They affect the production of hormones, the rate at which enzymes will work. They affect us tremendously. But it has recently been discovered that the body clocks are also profoundly affected by electromagnetic waves, especially those waves when they are concerned with the waxing and waning of the moon, and also solar magnetic storms, flares, storms on the surface of the sun producing magnetic changes which affect man's body rhythms. We are beginning to find, and all these references that I'm giving you now could be found in a book put out recently called, I haven't got it here, it's called Something to Do with the Brain, and it's by Marilyn Ferguson. Marilyn Ferguson, if you have the money, you should buy it. If you haven't got the money, steal the money and buy it. It is a book worth having. This book by Marilyn Ferguson, The Brain. And we are finding that scientifically that magnetic fields affect telepathy. Magnetic fields affect telepathy. Increasing the magnetic field about a human being artificially, by that we mean making it stronger than the Earth, increases telepathy. You'll find that on page 25 in that book. And also we are finding that sunspots, that's those solar flares, and thunderstorms inhibit telepathy, meaning that the magnetic pulsations of the Earth are affected by these magnetic storms, and the Earth's geomagnetism is influenced. It is of interest here and relevant that Professor Hans Holzer of a parapsychology college in New York has had that instrument, which you see on the table, for something like 4 years, 5 years, Claire. When was it that we gave him that instrument? 5 years ago. And he uses this instrument, which we shall be demonstrating later on, to enhance extrasensory perception, which of course includes the field of telepathy and so on. So here is quite scientific backing for the sort of thing that we have been struggling on for years. Men are incredibly sensitive to magnetism. We don't register changes in the magnetic field of the Earth consciously, but sometimes during thunderstorms or before a thunderstorm we feel very, very uncomfortable, not so much because of the change of temperature and so on, but traditionally throughout history, just before a thunderstorm, there is a time of tension in which people feel awkward. I always like to watch flies. Flies are very interesting. Somebody's nodding his head. Thank God I'm not completely way out as to be the only person in the room. There are two ways in which I can tell from animals when it's going to rain. First of all, there's an increasing activity of flies which fly around in a sort of a disturbed fashion. And secondly, my cat always washes her ears before it's going to rain. She will lick her paws and do that to her ears, not the other part of the body, just the ears. And if she goes to the ears, you can be absolutely sure, I would bet on it, that it would rain within 24 hours. And I merely mention this to show how we are all part of and associated with the Earth's magnetic fields and respond to them continuously. Thank you, Lee. We'll have that up on the board, please, just to show the sort of magnetic fields we're interested in. Now, it has been shown that you and I can respond to a magnetic field only 4 times stronger than the Earth. If the magnetic field is only 4 times stronger than the Earth, this is enough for us to begin to notice that it is pulsating. It's very interesting that scientists have noticed too that the effect of fluctuating magnetic fields and the changes of their pulsation put people to sleep easily. And I think Betty Moseley, who is not here at the moment, Betty Moseley and Claire Warner would probably confirm that in the thousands of treatments that we've given with magnetic fields, one of the 2 side effects of treatment with magnetism, one was to make the patient tend to sleep more deeply at night. They tended to have a deeper sleep at night, and of course they very, very frequently, just the moment that they were put on the treatment couch, they flopped off into a lovely sleep and were always irritated by having to have their treatment stopped. They loved it so much. This is Japanese, isn't it? Yes. This machine put out by the Kawasaki electric industry, who produces a variety of magnetic instruments, provides a sort of a headgear in which you place these on the eyes, and very, very soon it produces sleep. It doesn't in me, but then it might in you. Would you mind, please? Just any order. They're not important. Can we come to that later on, Claire? I'm going to leave you to clear that one up with them. Then we have the factor of a null electromagnetic field. By that we mean that we have always lived in the Earth's magnetic field and love it. We live in it happily, and when it is taken away from us, when there is no magnetic field at all, then things begin to go wrong. The moment that you take away even the Earth's weak magnetic field from insects and animals, things begin to go wrong. On man, of course, there are these adverse effects on animals, but on man, for instance, who can normally, as it were, integrate the flickering pictures of a film. We see the flickering pictures of a film, and the moment that they get up to 20 per second, it becomes a continuous vision. And we say that we are looking at the film. Before that, we just see flickering. In fact, when your magnetic fields are reduced, you begin to see a continuous picture from about 10 pictures per second. This is one of the effects of reducing the magnetic field in a man. Then it has been discovered that the most sensitive part of the human body to magnetism is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, very recently discovered that the hypothalamus is the most sensitive part to magnetic fields. And the hypothalamus, ladies and gentlemen, is that part of the brain which is closestly related to emotion. It is the physical part of the body which is closest related to emotion. Apart from the endocrine gland, the pancreas, I'm talking about nervous tissue now, the third ventricle, the hypothalamus. It's very interesting that the hypothalamus is the floor of the third ventricle. And it is the third ventricle which has been said to be the north pole of man's magnetic aura. That is why I stressed that a little earlier. And so here we find that the center of emotional control is the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is the most sensitive region of the body to magnetism. Now, can you believe that such a fact of such importance could be ignored by the medical world? When we realize how many diseases stem from emotional imbalance, how can it be overlooked for much longer? This may explain why it is that investigations into 28,000 psychiatric admissions to hospital in New York, 28,000 cases observed of admission into psychiatric hospitals, there was a striking correlation to these admissions to the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field. As the Earth's magnetic field waxed and waned, the admission to psychiatric hospitals increased tremendously. This correlation has been well established, and the odds against this occurrence happening by chance, 10,000 to 1. 10,000 to 1 that this is by chance. And so we go on a little further, and we find that in Dade County, which I believe is in Florida, it has been shown by the University of Miami that showed a scientifically sound relationship between the phases of the moon and the murder rate in Dade County in Florida. Then somebody else has pointed out that the human body and the surface of the earth are similar in components, about 80% water and 20% mineral. And all these materials, water and minerals, respond to the solar and lunar cycles. I'd like to add a little comment of Alice Bailey's here, which would have been, in fact, the Tibetan's comment: where land, earth, and water meet, magic is performed in the body. Where land, air, and water meet in the body, magic is performed. And indeed, magic is performed, as you well know, on the surface of the human lungs, where land, air, and water meet. And where the prana, which charges the magnetic aura of man, is removed from the oxygen molecule. And I hope that some of you have been able to see Brenda Selby Johnson's magnificent photographs of what we believe to be elements of the vitality globule attached to oxygen. Then there is another interesting factor today, and that we're beginning to find out, and that is that the earth is an electrical generator. The earth itself produces a magnetic field and acts as an electrical generator. And when we take into account the Finalen belts of radiation about the earth, we have evidence from our space satellites that the planet may be producing a direct current, a DC current of 50,000 volts. We're living in a field of 50,000 volts and hardly know it at all. Now, I can make a very esoteric observation here, and I can say this, that in your long path that you tread towards the summit of the mountain of initiation, sometime, somewhere in one of the initiations, you discover not only that this is indeed true, that the real nature of the Earth's core is a giant generator, but you become part of that generator from that moment onwards, and that generator's energy becomes available to you at a certain initiation. I thought that I would just pop that in relevant there without going too far into the subject. Then, of course, we could refer to the work of Bob Becker on the brain and elsewhere. We should also remember that Bob Becker has been able to regenerate the limbs of animals almost entirely by applying electromagnetic fields to the proximity of the stumps. The arms and legs of mice have been severed, and by applying electromagnetic fields to these stumps, these limbs have regenerated almost completely. And even now we're beginning to, as it were, work towards the possibility that human limbs severed in accidents may be regenerated to a tremendous extent. I know it sounds way out, but my God, what did it sound like 20 years ago? Just let me finish this discourse and we'll have questions. All right, we'll have that question now, young man, as I have finished my references. We're going to go on to the more practical side, and we'll have the questions now relevant to what I've said, if you wish.
What you just said is, do you think that the magnetism is affecting your body somehow? It still remains.
We don't know. The electromagnetic, it's electrical as well, tends to produce a condition in which ionic deposits or ionic concentrations are brought to the stump heads, and probably the deposition of the most suitable materials is brought about, as you say, within the etheric matrix. This is the marvel, is not growing flesh. When a piece of shrapnel took a large part of my back away in the war, and it began to heal, great protuberances of flesh grew out of this aperture. The ability to grow flesh is not difficult, but the ability to grow flesh within a matrix to resemble a limb with deposition of bone material and so on. That is what is so sensational about Becker's work. And of course it brings to your mind the fact of the phantom limb. And the phantom limb has been investigated more intensely recently. The phantom limb phenomenon, you know, is when the arm or leg is removed by accident, the person concerned feels still his fingers, feels pain in the fingers, and you can say what you like to him, give all sorts of physiological explanations for it. They say that they can feel their fingers, and sometimes they search for a part of their hand to try and scratch it when it becomes itchy. I've spoken to a man who had lost his leg, and he says that he can tell in his leg, that his phantom limb, when the ground is becoming rougher, just as he would in his ordinary limb. Now, the teachings of C.W. Leadbeater come back into some more reverence here and respect, though they have been debunked by many. And Leadbeater always maintained that we have a phantom limb made of etheric substance long after the limb has been removed. The tendency seems to be that after a while even the etheric part of the limb shortens into a sort of a half limb, and so on. We've also the work of Kirlian photography, which shows that even if you snip off the top of a leaf, we can still photograph an outline of the part of the leaf that is missing. Even though that part has been removed completely, there lies, as it were, an etheric outline or phantom of the leaf, which responds in Kirlian photography.
This is off the subject. Have they ever tried, I wouldn't like to think about it, but with animals, people have experiments, have they tried?
No, they haven't. And you know, when I see people in this country all playing with Kirlian photography and making cameras and so on and so on and so on, it's all very with it. But for heaven's sake, do get things in perspective. And Kirlian photography requires immense amounts of money and research work to detect the slightest consistency in the flares that are being given off from the surface of the skin. I think Dr. Al Smith has already pointed out to you that after immense amount of work in San Antonio, they're only just beginning to discover, is it all right to talk about this, Dr. Al, about the rheumatoid effect, beginning to find that when the emissions of the fingers are noted very, very carefully, instead of getting flares of a regular pattern in arthritics, we tend to get little islands of no flare, which have been observed so frequently that we begin to think that it may be possible to begin to diagnose diseases well in advance of their manifesting through Kirlian photography. Yes, sir. One more. May I just deal with that question first, because we're taping. Your first question is, who did the work on the hypothalamus, and where was it done? How was it done? My answer to that is that it was done by Russian experimentation, and where it was done I can't remember, but it is referred to in the brain, that book that I've got it upstairs. I can send for it for your perusal. Would you arrange for that later, Mrs. Mosley, that the book by Marilyn Ferguson be brought down and put on the table for inspection? Yes, sir. This gentleman here can come forward.
Dr. Baker, the polarities of men being what they are, as you have illustrated on the board, with the north at the top and the south at the bottom. Well, if a person who lives below the equator, does his polarity still remain of equal intensity, or is there any slight variation?
Well, I'm pretty sure there is a variation, because the people who tended to have evolved around the equator vary very considerably to the people who evolved in the northern regions. And I'm quite sure that there are effects, but I don't know. I just don't know the answer to your question there.